rencontre. L'OMSA, à travers ce webinaire, voudrait partager les résultats d'une étude, d'une revue sur la législation et la réglementation des professions vétérinaires. Cette étude a été réalisée par Kelsey Galantich, qui est la prochaine présentatrice. Kelsey est diplômée en droit de l'Université Californie. Elle est avocate agréée des États-Unis d'Amérique et travaille à l'OMSA depuis 2019. Kelsey a une riche expérience de travail en Amérique du Nord, en Amérique latine et depuis près de 3 ans donc en Afrique, dans les domaines du droit international, de l'environnement et particulièrement dans le domaine de la législation vétérinaire. Donc, Kelsey, vous avez la parole pour votre présentation.
Thank you. Let me just share. Okay, can you see? It's all good?
It's looking good.
All right. Oops, sorry. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. And yes, I'm very excited to share with you the results of a review of legislation on the veterinary professions in Africa, and specifically the results for Northwest and Central Africa. So first, some of the objectives of this review, it was to determine a legal basis for the regulation of the veterinary professions in Africa, and more specifically, to identify key gaps in legislation relating to veterinary paraprofessionals and community animal health workers. Another goal was to inform national and regional policymakers and legislators of strengths and weaknesses in regulating the veterinary workforce, and also to support ongoing WOA projects on veterinary workforce development in order to enhance the recognition and regulation of VPPs, and finally to offer suggestions for the reform, modernization, and harmonization of legislation in Africa. So in order to conduct this review, the first step was to review WOA PVS pathway reports for any mention of the regulation of the veterinary profession. Then the second step was to conduct online research of legislation for each country, just through simple internet search for the relevant legislation. Then the results of these two steps were validated through an email survey of each of the WOA delegates, just essentially asking the simple question of whether or not the legislation found through these two searches is up to date. Then each country's legislation was reviewed according to a list of essential elements for the regulation of the veterinary profession, many of which Anne-Marie just went over with you. And these essential elements were generated from the relevant provisions of the WOA Terrestrial Animal Health Code in collaboration with and according to the priority topics of the WOA Workforce Development Program. Then each country's results were collected in an Excel document in order to tabulate the findings, and a final report was generated of the overall compliance of the region with the essential elements. And individual country assessments are available for each country to review. So please follow up with me if you're interested in seeing the results for your country. Here are some of the essential elements, and again, many of them essential elements typically found in legislation regulating the veterinary profession. And again, many of them were just discussed by Anne-Marie, but some of the key ones are definitions of key terms, including veterinary paraprofessional, the creation of regulations or secondary legislation, the general recognition of veterinary paraprofessionals in the legislation. And for this one, basically just any mention of veterinary paraprofessionals at all in the legislation. And also the prerogatives and minimum initial education requirements for veterinarians and VPPs. This review also took into consideration the continuing education requirements, both for vets and VPPs. as well as the supervision of veterinarians by VPPs, whether that was mentioned in the law or required by the law. And there were also various elements related to veterinary statutory bodies, including, along with the power, a legal basis to create a veterinary statutory body, the functions of the veterinary statutory body, its disciplinary powers, and the power of the veterinary statutory body to regulate both veterinarians and VPPs. This review also took into consideration some elements that might be found in legislation other than that regulating the veterinary profession, but that are still important. But these were a bit outside of the scope of the legislation collected, but this includes prescription of veterinary medicinal products by veterinarians and or by VPPs, as well as the role of the veterinary statutory body in education. And again, these could be found in legislation such as medicines legislation or legislation on education, which again was just a bit outside of the scope of the legislation collected. There were very good results, a response rate. 50 out of the 54 members surveyed responded, so 93% of the countries. 26 out of the 28 countries, 26 out of the 28 countries surveyed from North and West Central Africa. So 93% of those countries responded and confirmed that the legislation collected was or was not up to date. In total, 119 pieces of legislation were collected and examined. Of those, 52 were primary legislation or acts of parliament, and 67 pieces of secondary legislation or regulations. And then 24 out of the 50 countries that responded actually said that they had a draft law in progress, which we didn't actually specifically ask for, but it was just good to know there's a lot of work going on. 12 of which were from North Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa. 40 out of these 50 countries that responded have primary legislation to regulate the veterinary profession. Of the 26 that responded from North, West, and Central Africa, there were 23 countries that responded that they have legislation specifically on this topic. 32 countries have a specific law on veterinary practice. So this can be Veterinary Surgeons Act or Veterinary Practice Act. 15 of which, of the 26 countries in North, West, and Central Africa. Then 8 countries have a regulation or regulate the veterinary profession in a more general law. So this could be just a general animal health law. 6, and this was 6 out of the 26 countries in North, West, and Central Africa. And then 8 countries have regulations to implement the primary legislation. And of the 26 countries in North, West, and Central Africa, this is 12 countries. Here is an overview of the results and how many countries or how many of the elements were included in the legislation examined. So for the region, there were 50% of countries have 15 or more, or 70% or more of the 21 essential elements. 44% of countries in West and Central Africa have 70% or more of the 21 essential elements, and 20% of the countries in North Africa have 70% or more of the essential elements. And here it's worth noting that North Africa has less veterinary paraprofessionals than other subregions. So this could be part of that difference. So here's a sub-regional comparison of the results. So this is the average percentage per sub-region of the inclusion of the 21 essential elements that are likely found in the Veterinary Practice Act or legislation regulating the veterinary profession. So you can see there's not a huge variation between the different sub-regions, and it's worth noting that none of them have less than or more than 75% of the elements included in the legislation. So all subregions could benefit from reviewing these elements in the law. Here are the regional results of the review, and the elements that were included in 70% or more of the legislation surveyed. So you can see that the top 4 are related to VSBs and the general regulation of veterinarians. So first, creation of VSB, initial education requirements and qualifications of veterinarians, and the power of VSB to register workers. And here's a comparison of the regional results as well as the North Africa and West and Central Africa results. And you can see that there's not an enormous variation within the different subregions from the region, except for definition section. You can see the definition of veterinary practice. North African countries tended to not have as many definitions or a definition section in the legislation. So here's the results of the essential elements that were less likely to be included in the law, or less covered within the legislation surveyed. And you can see that 3 of the bottom 4 elements are covered by less than 40% of countries, and 3 out of the 4 were relating to veterinary paraprofessionals, including definition of veterinary paraprofessional, the requirement for a veterinary paraprofessional to be supervised by veterinarians, and the requirement of a VSB to regulate both veterinarians and VPPs. And here is a comparison of the regional results with the North African and the West and Central African results. So even though they're used more in, an interesting result was that even though they're used more in West and Central Africa, VPPs were 80% of the North African countries recognized them in the legislation. And you can see here also that the results were a bit more mixed. And it's notable that the North African countries, again, tended not to include definitions or definition section. It's also notable that one of the countries in North Africa had a legal basis for the VSB to regulate VPPs, which made this element a bit higher because of the lower number of countries in this region, but sub-region. But in any case, only a little over 6% of the countries in West and Central Africa included a legal basis for the VSB to regulate VPPs, despite the large amount of workers in this sub-region. And here's a snapshot of the elements relating to veterinary statutory bodies. So you can see that all of them were 85% or above, except for the requirement for the VSB to regulate both veterinarians and VPPs. And the sub-regional results were consistent with the regional results. So you can see that for North Africa, 20% of countries, and West Central Africa, a little over 6% of countries had a legal basis for the VSB to regulate both veterinarians and VPPs. It's also worth highlighting that only 45% of the 40 countries adopted secondary legislation or regulations. And this is important to ensure that the primary legislation or law is implemented, because sometimes the elements there was a legal basis for the element to be covered in secondary legislation, but then the secondary legislation was never enacted, which left that element not fully covered. So for example, 72.5% of countries had a legal basis to establish a code of conduct, but then based on the research conducted, only 38% of the countries actually put in place a code of conduct. So this is worth highlighting, that there could be more work done on secondary legislation or regulations. Here is a comparison of the results directly relating to veterinarians and those directly relating to VPPs. So you can see that all of the regulation, or 4 out of these 5, 4 out of 3 out of the 4 elements here that directly relate to veterinarians are 90% or above. But then in contrast, the elements relating to VPPs are less than 50%, except for the prerogatives of veterinary paraprofessionals, but still significantly lower. And again, the final one is the creation of a legal basis to create a veterinary statutory body and the power of the veterinary statutory body to regulate both veterinarians and VPPs. So you can see the contrast here. And here are the sub-regional results. So these are the results for North Africa, and they're again consistent with the regional results. The elements directly relating to veterinarians tended to be covered more than those relating to veterinary paraprofessionals. And the same goes for West and Central Africa, where 100%, for example, of countries included a legal basis for initial education of veterinarians. 44% of countries had the same legal basis for veterinary paraprofessionals. So this review also took into consideration community animal health workers and whether the legislation recognized this category of workers. So according to a survey conducted by the Regional Core Group for Africa in 2018, 81% of countries in West and Central Africa responded that they do in fact use community animal health workers, and none in North Africa. But it was found that only 13% of the 40 countries surveyed have a legal basis for this category of workers. One of these, the 5 countries that were found to have a legal basis for this was in West Africa, but otherwise, this category of workers was even less covered by the legislation than veterinary paraprofessionals. And here's also a survey of data from the WAHIS. The survey asked countries whether or not the number of veterinary paraprofessionals involved in the animal health activities, and also veterinary paraprofessionals involved in community animal health, or community animal health workers. So you can see that 67% of North African countries and 100% of West African countries responded that they have workers for veterinary paraprofessionals involved in animal health activities. And then actually 33% of countries in the latest WAHIS survey for North Africa mentioned that they use community animal health workers. And 81% of countries in West and Central Africa. But again, the community animal health workers were only 5 countries out of the 40 included a legal basis for this category of workers. This review also took note of some trends in legal drafting, and a lot of them Anne-Marie also just went over with you, but it was noted that in several instances there were countries that had duplicated provisions among laws. Often, as just discussed, some elements were left to secondary legislation without the secondary legislation being enacted. Sometimes there was a term defined, but then a different term was used throughout the law. So, for example, veterinary surgery was defined, but then veterinary medicine was the term used throughout the text. And then often there were instances where veterinarians and VPPs were mentioned together, or there was just an ambiguous definition of veterinary practice, which made it difficult to distinguish within the text the differences and just between these 2 categories of workers generally. And it has the effect of creating no legal distinction between the 2 professions.
Kelsey, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. So key takeaways, the VPPs are underrepresented and underregulated in legislation compared to veterinarians. And it's notable that most countries currently lack a legal basis for the national VSB to regulate VPPs. Nearly all countries could benefit from increased efforts to clarify, define, and consistently use essential terms in the legislation, in particular the term veterinary practice and veterinary medicine. Most countries could benefit from the creation of secondary legislation in order to ensure that the primary legislation is implemented. And most countries could benefit from more regularly reviewing legislation to ensure legal clarity. And with that, I'll quickly go over this slide on the Veterinary Legislation Support Program. It's a program offered by WAHA in order to help with the review and modernization and harmonization of national legislation. Some of you might already be familiar with this program, but it essentially consists of 2 different steps: an identification mission in which the veterinary legislation is reviewed by 2 experts, a veterinarian and a lawyer. And it looks for gaps within the legislation. A lot of them involve these essential elements, but most are related to the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, specifically the chapter on veterinary legislation. And depending on the results of the identification mission and whether the country wants to continue, there is an option to continue on to a legislation agreement in which the country, along with 2 experts, will actually draft or amend legislation according to what is found in the identification mission. And this program is optional, like as Sonia explained, the rest of the steps within the PVS pathway.